You wake up, but the world you knew is no longer there. The chair, the walls, even your name. Suddenly everything feels like a poorly built stage set. If you feel like you're going insane, congratulations, you've finally started to see. And no one really prepares you for that moment, because it doesn't feel like clarity, it feels like something essential just slipped out of place. The things that used to feel solid now feel unstable, almost artificial. And the strangest part is that everything looks exactly the same, but it doesn't feel the same anymore. It's subtle, but it's undeniable. So before you try to understand it, pause for a second. Feel your body. Notice your breath. Look at your hands, not as objects, but as something you're directly experiencing right now. Because what's happening here is not the world breaking. It's the way you've been seeing it starting to crack. Something subtle begins to slip, and it doesn't feel like gaining clarity, it feels like losing ground. At first, it's almost imperceptible. You're still moving through your day, still answering to your name, still recognizing your reflection. But underneath that surface, something no longer holds the same weight. The sense of being a fixed, solid someone starts to loosen, like a knot that's been tied for years finally giving way. And that's where the confusion starts, because everything you were taught says that growth should feel like becoming more defined, more certain, more stable. But this doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like the opposite. It feels like you're dissolving. What's happening here is not that you're breaking. It's that the idea of you as a solid object is collapsing. In physics, there's this strange phenomenon called the collapse of the wave function. Before something is observed, it exists as a range of possibilities, not a single fixed state. Only when it's measured does it choose a form. But what no one tells you is that something similar can begin to happen inside your own perception. The version of you that once felt so clear, your personality, your preferences, your story, starts to feel less like a solid structure and more like a pattern that's being continuously generated. And once you notice that, you can't fully go back. You start to see how quickly your identity shifts depending on context. How the you at work is not the same you when you're alone. How your thoughts don't arrive from a central commander, but just appear. How even your emotions move through you like weather, not like permanent traits. So the question quietly emerges. If all of this is changing, reacting, appearing, what exactly is stable? This is where the ground disappears, because the mind is wired to look for something it can hold on to. A definition, a conclusion, a fixed point. But instead, what you begin to encounter is fluidity, constant, unpredictable, and at times deeply unsettling. You may even feel moments where you can't locate yourself in the way you used to, not physically but psychologically. It's like trying to grab water with your hands. The tighter you try to define yourself, the more it slips through. And there's a cost to this. Fluidity sounds freeing in theory, but in practice it can feel disorienting. Decisions become harder, not easier. If you're not a fixed identity, then what are your choices based on? If your preferences are not solid, how do you trust them? Even simple questions, what do I want? What do I believe? Who am I becoming? Start to lose their familiar structure. This is the price no one talks about, because in this state, you're no longer operating as a thing moving through a predictable world. You begin to sense yourself more like a field, something open, responsive, and undefined. And while that opens the door to possibility, it also removes the comfort of certainty. You are no longer a fixed character. You are potential in motion, and potential doesn't come with instructions. There's also a strange tension that builds between what you perceive and what you've been told reality is. Your senses still show you a stable world, solid objects, clear boundaries, defined roles. But something in you knows that this stability is not as absolute as it appears. It's more like a continuous rendering, a moment-to-moment construction. You look at your hand, and for a split second, it doesn't feel as obvious as it used to. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle shift, like seeing the pixels behind the image. And that realization doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brings a quiet kind of fear. Because if nothing is as solid as it seemed, then where do you stand? This is the edge, the place where the old structure has loosened, but a new way of relating hasn't stabilized yet. And in this gap, it's very tempting to rush towards something, anything, that feels certain again. A new identity, a new belief system, a new label that promises to hold everything together. And that's where a different kind of trap begins to form, one that looks like progress on the surface, but carries the same structure underneath. Right when everything starts to loosen, when the old identity no longer feels reliable, there's a very strong impulse to rebuild something in its place, not because you want to deceive yourself, but because the human system is not comfortable with open space. It wants shape, it wants meaning, it wants something it can recognize and say, "This is me." So a new version begins to form. It often looks wiser, calmer, more aware. It uses different language. It talks about presence, consciousness, energy. It rejects the old patterns and adopts new ones that feel more elevated, more refined. And without noticing it, you've created a new identity, one that feels like freedom but is still built on the same mechanism. This is where the trap becomes almost invisible, because this version of you is not obviously limited. It feels expansive. It feels awake. You may even notice that others respond differently to you. They might see you as grounded, insightful, or evolved, and that feedback reinforces the structure. But if you look closely, something subtle is still happening underneath. There is still a center that wants to be seen a certain way, a quiet need to maintain this new image, a resistance to anything that threatens it. Instead of, "I am this personality," it becomes, "I am someone who is beyond personality." Different words, same pattern. The mind is incredibly adaptive. If it can no longer survive as the old identity, it will upgrade itself. It will build a more sophisticated version that appears free from ego while quietly depending on it. This is what makes it so difficult to detect, because now even your awareness can become part of the performance. You begin to notice your thoughts, but also subtly judge them. You observe your emotions, but also try to appear unaffected by them. You speak about detachment, but inside there's still tension. It's just more refined. And the real danger is not that this happens, it's that it feels like a rival. You may start to believe that you've crossed some invisible line, that you've reached a level where you're no longer caught in the illusions that affect other people, and from that position, growth quietly stops. Not because there's nothing more to see, but because you've identified with the one who sees. There's a certain rigidity that begins to appear, a subtle closing. You might avoid situations that trigger strong emotions, not out of clarity, but to protect the image of being centered. You might reject ordinary concerns, work, relationships, daily frustrations, as if they are beneath you. But life doesn't stop testing you. It will bring friction in ways that your new identity cannot easily absorb. And when that happens, the gap between who you think you are and what you actually experience becomes harder to ignore. That tension is important because it reveals something essential. The problem was never the old identity itself. The problem was the need to be fixed in any identity at all, even a spiritual one. If you're honest in those moments, you may notice that the discomfort you tried to escape at the beginning is still here, just wearing different clothes. The uncertainty, the openness, the lack of solid ground, it never actually disappeared. It was just covered. And this is where many people pause their process without realizing it. They settle into a more comfortable illusion, one that feels meaningful enough to stay in for years. A golden cage. It's stable, it's validated, and it protects you from the rawness of not knowing, but it also limits how deeply you can actually see. Because real clarity doesn't come from building a better identity. It comes from seeing through the need to build one at all. And that seeing is not comfortable. It starts to strip away even the refined layers, not violently but steadily. You begin to notice where you're still holding on, where you're still trying to control how you appear, even in subtle ways. And as those layers loosen, something else begins to emerge, not as a new identity, but as a space that doesn't need to define itself. At first, that space can feel empty, almost too quiet. Without the usual commentary, without the constant labeling, there's a kind of absence that the mind doesn't know how to interpret. And that's where the next threshold begins to reveal itself, not as a concept, but as a direct encounter with what remains, when even the need to be someone awakened starts to fade. When the need to define yourself starts to fade, what's left is not immediately peaceful. It doesn't feel like clarity or light or relief. It feels like silence, and not the kind you're used to. This silence doesn't come from the absence of noise. It comes from the absence of structure. There's no clear you at the center organizing everything. No constant narration explaining what's happening, who you are, where this is going. And without that familiar voice, the experience can feel disorienting. Almost like something essential is missing. But if you stay with it for a moment, not trying to fix it, not trying to fill it, you begin to notice that what feels like nothing is not actually empty. It's open. In physics, what we call empty space is not truly empty. The vacuum, at the smallest scales, is alive with activity. Fluctuations, probabilities, energy appearing and disappearing faster than we can track. What looks like nothing is actually the foundation of everything. Something similar begins to reveal itself here. When the labels drop, when the constant definitions loosen, you start to sense a kind of background presence. It doesn't have a shape. It doesn't speak in words, but it's undeniably there. At first, this can feel unsettling because you've been trained to associate nothingness with loss, with absence, with something gone wrong. So when you encounter this open space, the mind may react with subtle fear. It might try to bring back thoughts, distractions, even problems, just to re-establish a sense of familiarity, because problems, in a strange way, feel more comfortable than emptiness. But if you don't immediately follow that impulse, something shifts. You begin to notice that this space is not against you. It's not trying to erase you. In fact, everything you experience seems to arise within it. Sensations, thoughts, sounds, even the sense of being a person. They come and go, but the space remains. And that realization changes the way you relate to what you experience. Instead of holding on to things, you start to see them as temporary formations, like patterns appearing in a field that doesn't depend on them to exist. Your thoughts are no longer commands. Your emotions are no longer definitions. They're movements. This can feel freeing, but also strangely impersonal. Because if everything is arising and dissolving in this open field, then what exactly is solid? What can you truly rely on? This is where the discomfort deepens for a moment. Not because something is wrong, but because the old reference points are gone. The mind wants to rebuild them, to anchor itself again in something fixed. But the more you look, the harder it becomes to find anything that doesn't shift. Even your body, which once felt like the most stable thing, begins to feel more like a process than an object. Sensations change, tension appears and disappears. There's no single point you can isolate and say, this is permanently me. It's all moving. And yet the space in which all of this movement happens doesn't seem to move in the same way. It doesn't come and go with each thought or sensation. It's simply there, allowing everything. That contrast becomes impossible to ignore. You start to realize that what you feared as emptiness is actually the most stable aspect of your experience. Not stable in a rigid sense, but in a way that doesn't depend on any particular form. And still, there's a subtle challenge here. Because it's easy to begin rejecting the forms themselves, to see thoughts, emotions, and the physical world as less real, less important, to lean toward the space and away from what appears within it. That split can happen very quietly. You might start to feel detached from everyday life, as if everything is slightly unreal or distant. Conversations, responsibilities, even relationships can begin to feel like surface-level movements compared to the depth of this silent background. And while that might seem like insight, it carries a hidden imbalance, because the same space that allows silence also allows form. The same openness that holds stillness also holds movement, interaction, matter. Nothing is actually separate from it. The challenge is not to escape into the space, but to recognize how both coexist without conflict. And that's not something the mind immediately understands. It takes time for this to settle, for the nervous system to adjust to a reality where emptiness and form are not opposites, but expressions of the same field. Until then, there can be moments where you feel suspended between two worlds, no longer fully identified with the old structures, but not yet grounded in this new way of seeing. In that in-between, your attention becomes more important than ever, because where it rests, what it emphasizes begins to subtly shape how this entire field organizes itself into experience. Once you begin to notice that everything is arising within this open field, attention stops feeling like a passive thing. It starts to feel active, almost like a subtle force, not in a mystical or exaggerated way, but in a very direct, observable sense. Where your attention goes, something changes. You can test this in simple moments. Think about a small problem you've been dealing with, something unfinished, something slightly irritating. Notice what happens when your mind circles around it repeatedly. The more you focus on it, the more detailed it becomes, the more solid it feels. New layers appear, new concerns attached to it, and what was once small starts to feel complex. Now shift your attention away, not by suppressing it, but by genuinely placing your focus somewhere else. Your breath, a physical sensation, a task in front of you. The problem doesn't necessarily disappear, but it loses density. It stops expanding. This is not imagination, it's a pattern. In physics, the observer effect suggests that the act of observation influences what is being observed. At a microscopic level, measuring something changes its behavior. But you don't need a laboratory to see a version of this playing out in your daily life. Your attention is constantly measuring your experience, and whatever it rests on tends to organize itself more clearly, more rigidly. This is where things become both powerful and dangerous, because most of the time attention is not consciously directed. It's pulled, drawn toward what feels urgent, uncomfortable, or unresolved. And without noticing it, you end up reinforcing exactly what you're trying to move away from. You try to fix a situation, and instead of loosening it, you tighten it. You analyze a conversation again and again, hoping to understand it. And each time you replay it, the emotional charge grows stronger. You focus on what's missing in your life, and that sense of lack becomes more defined, more convincing. It starts to feel like reality itself is pushing back against you. But if you look carefully, something else is happening. Your resistance is acting like glue, not because you're doing something wrong, but because attention combined with tension has a stabilizing effect. It takes something fluid and gives it structure. It's like repeatedly tracing the same line until it becomes permanent. And this is why effort alone doesn't always lead to change. If the effort is coming from resistance, if it's driven by the need to get rid of something, then your attention stays locked onto the very pattern you're trying to dissolve. So the pattern holds. This is the subtle responsibility that comes with seeing more clearly. Not control in the sense of forcing outcomes, but awareness of how you are participating in what feels like external reality. You begin to notice small things. How a moment of irritation grows when you keep feeding it with thought. How a sense of ease appears when you stop interfering. How certain situations seem to shift, not instantly, not magically, but in response to a change in how you relate to them. It's almost like reality is responsive, but not in the way you were taught. Not through effort and pressure, but through the quality of your attention. And this can feel frustrating at first, because it removes the idea that you can dominate your experience into submission. It asks for something more precise, more honest. It asks you to see where you are adding unnecessary weight. There's also a deeper layer to this. It's not just about what you focus on, but how you focus. Attention can be tight, narrow, and controlling, or it can be open, allowing, and steady. These two modes don't produce the same result. When attention is tight, it tends to fragment things. It isolates problems, magnifies them, and creates a sense of pressure. When attention is more open, it allows movement. It gives space for things to shift on their own. You don't have to believe this, you can observe it directly. In a moment of tension, instead of trying to solve anything, just notice how you are looking at the situation. Feel the contraction. Then, without forcing a change, allow your attention to widen slightly. Include more of what's around you. The sounds, the sensations, the space itself. Something softens. The situation might not immediately resolve, but your relationship to it changes, and that alone begins to alter how it unfolds. This is where attention stops being just a mental function and starts to feel like a kind of interface between you and everything else. And the more you notice this, the harder it becomes to ignore a deeper question that starts to emerge. If your attention is constantly shaping your experience, if it is influencing how reality organizes itself around you, then who or what is actually directing that attention? Because up to now, it may have felt like you were in control of it. But as you look closer, that certainty begins to shift. As soon as the question of who is directing attention becomes real, something deeper starts to destabilize. Because up until now, even with all the shifts, there was still an assumption quietly running in the background that there is a center, a you, making choices, deciding where attention goes, managing life from somewhere inside the body. But when you look closely, that center becomes harder to locate. Thoughts appear on their own. Reactions happen before you can explain them. Attention moves, sometimes intentionally, sometimes pulled by something you didn't choose. And when you try to find the exact point from which all of this is being controlled, it starts to feel unclear. Not in an abstract way, but in a very direct, almost uncomfortable way. It's like reaching for something that used to feel obvious and finding empty space instead. And this is where the pressure begins to rise. Because at the same time that this inner center becomes less defined, your external life hasn't disappeared. You still have responsibilities, conversations, deadlines, people who expect you to show up as someone consistent. But inside, that consistency is no longer solid. It can feel like you're trying to operate a very specific role without fully identifying with it anymore, like wearing a name, a personality, a history, but knowing at some level that none of it fully captures what you are. This creates a kind of friction that's hard to explain to others. On one side, there's an expanding sense that what you are is not limited to this body, this story, or this moment. There's a feeling of openness, of being less confined, less separate. Sometimes it even feels like the boundary between you and everything else is thinner than it used to be. But on the other side, your body still operates within limits. It gets tired, it reacts to stress, it needs to eat, sleep, respond, decide. It exists in time, even if something in you feels outside of it. And holding both at once can feel overwhelming. It's like trying to pour something vast into something very specific. The scale doesn't match. The system strains to reconcile the difference. You may notice this in small, practical ways. Simple decisions can feel heavier than before, not because they're more important, but because the usual reference point, what do I want, doesn't feel as clear. If the sense of a fixed self is dissolving, then what exactly is making the choice? You might find yourself pausing longer, hesitating, or even feeling detached from decisions that used to feel automatic. In relationships, this can become even more noticeable. People interact with you based on who you've been. They expect familiar responses, familiar emotions, familiar patterns. But inside, those patterns don't feel as solid anymore. There can be a gap between what's expected and what naturally arises. And that gap can feel isolating. Not because you're disconnected from others, but because the way you relate is changing faster than the structures around you. You may feel less reactive, but also less defined, more open, but also less anchored. This is the biological side of the shift that no one really prepares you for. Your nervous system is still wired for identity, for stability, for clear boundaries. It evolved to keep you safe, to maintain a coherent sense of self. And now that coherence is being questioned, so it tries to compensate. It might create subtle anxiety, a sense of unease without a clear cause. It might push you to re-establish control, to define yourself again, to return to something familiar. Or it might go the other way, into numbness, into detachment, as if stepping back from everything is the safest option. Neither extreme really resolves the tension, because the expansion you've noticed isn't something you can undo, and the human system you live in isn't something you can bypass. They have to learn how to coexist. And that takes time. There's a kind of integration that needs to happen, where the vastness you sense doesn't erase the human experience, and the human experience doesn't confine the vastness. But in this phase, that balance isn't stable yet, so it can feel like you're moving between two modes. At times, everything feels open, fluid, connected. At other times, you're pulled back into the specifics of life, tasks, roles, emotions, and it can feel almost jarring, like switching between two different realities. This movement is not a mistake, but it does raise a very practical question that becomes impossible to ignore. If you are no longer a fixed local identity, how do you actually live? How do you choose, act, relate, and function in a world that still operates through form, through roles, through time? Because whatever this is, it's not asking you to disappear. It's asking for a different way of being present within the limits of a human life. And finding that way is not about thinking your way through it. It requires something more subtle, something that begins to reveal itself in small signals that don't come from control, but from alignment. In the middle of all this uncertainty, something small begins to happen. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just subtle enough that you might dismiss it if you're not paying attention. Moments where things seem to line up without force. You think about someone you haven't spoken to in a while, and they reach out. You hesitate about a decision, and a piece of information appears at the right time. You take a step without being completely sure, and something in your environment responds in a way that feels precise. Not planned, not controlled, but not random either. At first, it can feel like coincidence, and sometimes it is. But as these moments start to repeat, a pattern becomes harder to ignore. There's a kind of feedback happening, not in words, not as instructions, but as alignment, as if reality is quietly responding to the way you are positioned internally. This is where something shifts from confusion to orientation, because up to this point, trying to control everything has only created more tension. Trying to define yourself has only made things more unstable. But here, you start to see that there's another way of moving, one that doesn't rely on force, it relies on sensitivity. You begin to notice that when you are tense, when you're trying to push outcomes, things tend to feel blocked or distorted. Communication becomes harder, timing feels off, even small actions seem to meet resistance. But when there's less internal pressure, when you're not trying to force clarity or control the next step, something opens. The right conversation happens more naturally. The next step becomes visible without overthinking. You don't feel like you're guessing as much. It's not that life becomes perfect, it's that it becomes responsive. And the key difference is not what you do, but how you are when you do it. This is where synchronicity starts to function less like a mystery and more like a compass. Not something you chase, not something you try to manufacture, but something you notice, something that reflects back to you whether you're in friction or in alignment. You can test this in very simple ways. Take a moment where you feel uncertain about something, an action, a decision, even a conversation you need to have. Instead of immediately analyzing it, pause. Feel what's happening in your body. Notice if there's tension, urgency, or pressure to resolve it quickly. Then, without trying to fix the feeling, let your attention soften. Let the urgency drop just a little. You're not abandoning the situation, you're just removing the excess force. From that place, take a small step. Not a perfect step, not a guaranteed one, just the next available movement that doesn't feel like you're pushing against yourself. And then watch, not obsessively, not with expectation, but with quiet awareness. Notice how reality responds. Notice if things become slightly easier, slightly clearer, or if something unexpected supports that direction. This is not about magical thinking. It's about calibration. Your system is constantly interacting with everything around you. And when you're in a state of internal conflict, that interaction tends to create noise. When there's less conflict, the signal becomes clearer. Synchronicity is often just that, signal clarity. But there's a subtle trap here too. As soon as you start noticing these patterns, the mind may try to take control of them. It might start looking for signs everywhere, trying to interpret everything as meaningful, trying to use synchronicity to guarantee outcomes. And the moment that happens, the clarity fades. Because now you're back in control mode, back in effort, back in trying to force reality to behave a certain way. What made those moments work was not your ability to predict them, but your willingness to not interfere. So the balance is delicate. You stay open but not passive. You act but not from pressure. You notice patterns, but you don't cling to them. Over time, this creates a different kind of trust. Not trust in a fixed plan or a guaranteed result, but trust in your ability to move with what's actually happening, to adjust, to respond, to stay connected, even when things are not fully clear. And this begins to resolve some of the tension from before, because instead of needing a solid identity to guide your actions, you start to rely on something more immediate, a kind of real-time alignment that doesn't require you to define exactly who you are. But this also changes your expectations. You may have thought that all of this was leading somewhere final, a stable state, a clear arrival, a point where everything makes complete sense. And as these moments of alignment increase, it can almost feel like you're getting closer to that, like you're about to arrive, but that assumption carries something hidden inside it. There's a quiet expectation that builds along the way, even if you never say it out loud, that all of this is leading somewhere final, a point where the confusion ends, where the tension resolves, where you finally stand on solid ground again, only this time a better kind of ground. More aware, more stable, untouchable in some sense. And the closer you feel to alignment, the more convincing that expectation becomes. Things start to flow a little easier. You feel less reactive. You notice patterns more quickly. There's a sense that you're beginning to understand how this works. It can feel like you're approaching the finish line, but then something unexpected happens. Life doesn't stop. Challenges don't disappear. Emotions don't vanish. Uncertainty doesn't resolve into permanent clarity. In fact, in some moments, things can feel just as intense as before, only now you're more aware of it. And that can be confusing, because it breaks the idea that awakening was supposed to take you out of the human experience. It forces you to see something that doesn't match the expectation you may have been carrying. There is no final state where everything locks into place. What you're stepping into is not an escape from the system. It's a different relationship with it. This is where the perspective shifts in a way that can feel almost like a reversal. Instead of trying to leave the illusion behind, you begin to see that the illusion itself has a function, not as something to trap you, but as something that allows experience to exist in the first place. Without form, there is nothing to touch, nothing to interact with, nothing to feel. Without limitation, there is no contrast, no movement, no story. So the question changes. It's no longer how do I get out of this, but how do I move within this without getting lost in it? And that's a very different kind of learning. Because now, clarity is not measured by how far you've distanced yourself from life, but by how fully you can engage with it without collapsing back into unconscious patterns. You still feel things. You still have reactions. You still face situations that don't go the way you want. The difference is that there's more space around it, less automatic identification, more room to respond instead of just react. But that space doesn't mean perfection. You will still get pulled in sometimes. You will still lose that sense of openness and find yourself caught in old patterns. And when that happens, it can feel frustrating, especially if you believed you had already moved beyond them. This is where a deeper kind of honesty is required, not the kind that judges the experience, but the kind that sees clearly without needing it to be different. Because what's being revealed here is not a path toward becoming flawless. It's a process of becoming more aware of the movement between clarity and contraction, and that movement doesn't end. In fact, it becomes part of the experience itself. You begin to notice rhythms, periods where things feel open and aligned, followed by moments where everything feels dense and reactive again. Instead of seeing this as failure, you start to recognize it as part of how the system recalibrates, like breathing, expansion and contraction. Neither one is a mistake. This realization removes a certain kind of pressure, the pressure to arrive and to stabilize in a perfect state, to maintain a constant level of awareness. That pressure, ironically, was creating more tension than the experience itself. Without it, something relaxes. You stop trying to hold on to clarity, and instead, you begin to trust your ability to return to it, again and again. And that changes how you move, because now you're not chasing an endpoint. You're participating in something ongoing, something that includes both the open space you've discovered and the structured world you still live in. This is where the metaphor shifts. It's less like waking up from a dream and more like realizing you're inside a kind of simulation that you can now see through, but still interact with. You can't exit it, at least not in the way you once imagined, but you can understand its mechanics. You can see how identification forms, how attention shapes experience, how resistance creates density. And with that understanding, your role changes. You're no longer just a character being pushed around by circumstances, but you're also not outside the story entirely. You're somewhere in between, aware of the projection but still within it. And that position brings a new kind of responsibility, not heavy, not forced, but real. Because if the illusion is not the enemy, then rejecting it completely creates another imbalance. It pulls you away from the very field where this understanding is meant to be lived. And that's where another risk begins to show up, one that doesn't come from ignorance but from misinterpretation. A tendency to drift too far from the physical, from the grounded, from the human side of the experience. When the illusion is no longer seen as something to escape, but also no longer fully believed, there's a delicate space you begin to walk through. And it's easy to lose your footing there, because one of the most subtle reactions to everything you've seen is not fear, but withdrawal. Not in an obvious way, but in a quiet, almost reasonable shift away from the intensity of being human. You start to lean more into the space, into the openness, into the part of you that feels untouched. And compared to the noise of everyday life, that space feels clean, stable, safe. So without realizing it, you begin to spend more time there, less involved in conversations, less emotionally available, less affected by things that used to matter. On the surface, it can look like peace, like you've transcended the chaos, but something is missing. There's a difference between not being controlled by experience and not fully participating in it. And that difference can be very hard to detect from the inside. Because detachment can feel like clarity, you might notice that you don't react the same way anymore. Situations that once triggered strong emotions now pass with little disturbance. You observe more, engage less, and part of you may interpret that as progress. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's a form of disconnection, not from reality itself, but from your own capacity to be in it. The body often reveals this before the mind does. A certain flatness, a lack of depth in feeling, not suffering but also not fully alive, as if everything is slightly muted, and the mind, trying to make sense of it, might say, "This is what peace feels like." But if you stay honest, you can sense the difference. Peace is open and responsive. It allows movement, emotion, connection. Dissociation is more like stepping half a step back from everything, including yourself. It reduces intensity, but it also reduces presence. This is where the imbalance shows itself, because what you've seen, the openness, the fluidity, the lack of a fixed self, is real. But if that insight pulls you away from the physical world instead of deeper into it, something has gone slightly off-center. You begin to relate to life more as an observer than a participant, and while observation is powerful, it's not the whole picture. You are still here, in a body, in time, in relationships. There are still conversations that matter, decisions that have consequences, moments that require you to show up, not just as awareness, but as a human being. Ignoring that doesn't make you free. It creates a split. On one side, there's the space you've discovered. On the other, the life you're living. And instead of integrating them, you drift between them. This is where the idea of a middle path becomes practical, not philosophical. It's not about balancing two opposites. It's about allowing both dimensions to exist without rejecting either one. You don't have to give up the space to be engaged, and you don't have to lose yourself in engagement to stay connected to the space. But this requires something very grounded. It requires you to feel again. Not just observe feelings from a distance, but actually allow them to move through you without immediately stepping back, to stay present in a conversation even when it's uncomfortable, to care about outcomes without becoming trapped in them. This is where the integration becomes real, because now awareness is not something you retreat into, it's something you bring into action, into speech, into relationships, into the ordinary details of your day. And that can feel more challenging than anything before. It's easier to sit in stillness than to remain open in the middle of conflict. It's easier to feel connected when you're alone than when someone is triggering old patterns in you. But this is where everything you've seen begins to take form, not as an idea, but as a way of being. You start to notice small shifts, moments where you stay present instead of withdrawing, where you respond instead of shutting down, where you allow complexity instead of simplifying everything into distance. These moments may seem simple, but they are significant, because they reconnect what was starting to separate: the space and the form, the awareness and the body, the observer and the life being lived. And as that connection strengthens, something else becomes clear. This process is not just happening at the level of perception, it's also happening in your system, your brain, your body, your patterns. There's an adjustment taking place that doesn't happen instantly, a kind of rewiring that needs time to stabilize. And this is where patience becomes essential, not as an idea but as a necessity. Even when something becomes clear to you, deeply, undeniably clear, your body doesn't immediately catch up. There's a delay. You can see through old patterns, understand them, even feel detached from them in certain moments. But then in a completely ordinary situation, one of those patterns activates again. A reaction appears, a familiar tension rises, and it can feel confusing, almost contradictory. Part of you knows. Another part still responds as if nothing has changed. This is not a failure, it's timing. Your brain and nervous system are built on repetition. For years, maybe decades, they've been reinforcing certain ways of perceiving, reacting, and interpreting reality. These patterns are not just ideas, they are physical pathways, strengthened over time. So when your perception shifts, when you begin to see things differently, that shift happens faster in awareness than it does in biology. Your mind can recognize truth in an instant. Your body learns it slowly. And in that gap, there's friction. You might notice it in moments where you feel calm and clear one day, and then suddenly reactive the next. Or when you understand that something is not a threat, but your body still responds with tension, urgency, or discomfort. It's like your system is running two versions of reality at the same time, one based on what you've seen, another based on what it has practiced. And they don't always match. This is where many people begin to doubt themselves. They think, if I really understood this, I wouldn't feel this way anymore. But that assumption ignores how the system actually works. Understanding is not the same as integration. Integration is slower. It requires exposure, repetition, and most importantly, consistency in how you relate to what arises. Each time a familiar reaction appears and you meet it differently, not suppressing it, not feeding it, but allowing it without reinforcing it, you are subtly changing the pattern. Not dramatically, not instantly, but steadily. This is what rewiring looks like from the inside. It's not a single breakthrough. It's a series of small adjustments that accumulate over time. And often it doesn't feel impressive. In fact, it can feel repetitive. You may find yourself facing the same types of reactions again and again, as if nothing is changing. But if you look closely, there are differences. The reaction might last a little less time. The intensity might be slightly lower. Your recovery might be faster. There's more awareness present, even if the pattern still appears. These are signs of change, but because they're subtle, they're easy to overlook. The mind tends to look for clear, permanent shifts, something it can point to and say, now it's done. But the nervous system doesn't work that way. It updates through experience, not conclusions. So patience here is not optional. It's part of the process itself. You are, in a very real sense, teaching your system how to operate in a different way. Not through force, not through constant correction, but through exposure to a new kind of response. And this requires a certain kind of stability, not the old stability of fixed identity, but a steady willingness to stay present, even when the old patterns resurface. To not interpret them as regression, but as material that is still being processed. There's also something else happening during this phase. Your perception of reality itself begins to reorganize. Things you once took personally start to feel less personal. Situations that used to trigger strong narratives now appear more neutral. You begin to see how much of your experience was shaped not by what happened, but by how your system was conditioned to interpret it. And as that conditioning loosens, reality feels different. Not because the external world has changed, but because the filter through which you experience it is shifting. This can create moments of clarity that feel almost surprising. You respond differently without trying. You notice space where there used to be tension. You move through something that would have overwhelmed you before and it feels manageable. These moments matter. They show you that the change is not just conceptual, it's becoming embodied. But even here, the process is not linear. There will still be days where everything feels heavy again, where the clarity fades and the old patterns feel strong. And this is where the deeper understanding becomes important. Nothing has gone wrong. The system is adjusting, layer by layer. And as this adjustment continues, something else begins to shift in your relationship with reality itself. Not just how you perceive it, but how you value it. Because as the internal noise settles and the patterns loosen, the world doesn't disappear. It becomes more vivid in a different way. And that leads to a realization that can feel almost like a reversal of everything you thought this process was about. At some point, almost quietly, the way you see the world begins to turn again. Not back to what it was before, but into something you didn't expect. After all the loosening, all the questioning, all the moments where reality felt less solid, less defined, there can be a phase where everything starts to feel more real again, but not in the old way. Before, things felt real because you believed in them without question. Now they feel real in a different sense, more direct, more immediate, less filtered by the constant noise of interpretation. It's not that the illusion disappeared. It's that you can see it and still experience it fully. This is where a deeper understanding settles in, not as an idea, but as something you can feel in ordinary moments. The texture of a surface, the sound of someone's voice, the weight of your own body sitting still. None of this is dismissed anymore. In fact, it becomes more vivid. Because when you're no longer lost in constant identification, attention is freed. And that attention, when it's not tied up in tension or resistance, makes experience sharper, simpler, more direct. You start to notice that what you once called illusion is not fake. It's constructed, yes. It's shaped by perception, by interpretation, by the way your system organizes information. But that doesn't make it meaningless. It makes it specific. It makes it the only way something infinite can be experienced in a finite form. And this changes your relationship with it completely. Instead of trying to get out of the illusion, you begin to appreciate why it exists. Why there is form, limitation, separation, not as a mistake, but as a condition for experience itself. Without boundaries, there is no contact. Without contrast, there is no sensation. Without individuality, there is no relationship. So what once looked like a barrier starts to look more like a medium. The body is no longer just a limitation, it's an interface, a way for something vast to feel something precise, to taste, to touch, to connect, to care. And care becomes important again, not as attachment in the old sense where you cling to outcomes and define yourself through them, but as a natural expression of being involved. You begin to care about conversations, about people, about what you create, not because you need them to complete you, but because engaging with them is part of the experience itself. There's a kind of quiet appreciation that emerges. Simple things feel different, not exaggerated, not idealized, but more present. Drinking water, walking, listening, these are no longer just background activities. They are direct contact with reality as it is, right now. And there's something honest about that. Because you're no longer trying to turn life into something else. You're not trying to escape it, fix it, or transcend it into a permanent state of peace. You're meeting it where it actually happens, here, in form. At the same time, the clarity you've seen doesn't disappear. You still recognize that everything is changing, that nothing is fixed, that identity is fluid, but instead of that making things feel unstable, it adds a kind of lightness. You can engage without holding too tightly. You can care without collapsing into it. You can participate without forgetting what you've seen. And this is where the real shift becomes visible. The illusion is no longer something you're trapped in, but something you're moving through consciously. Not perfectly, not constantly, but with enough awareness that you're not completely lost in it anymore. There's a kind of cooperation that begins to form between the part of you that sees and the part of you that lives. And in that cooperation, something softens. You stop dividing experience into categories like real and unreal, spiritual and material, higher and lower. Those distinctions start to lose their importance. What matters more is how you are present within whatever is happening, because that presence shapes everything. Not by controlling reality, but by influencing how it's lived. And this brings a different kind of responsibility. Not heavy, not rigid, but undeniable. Because if this experience, this illusion, is the way life expresses itself through you, then how you meet it matters. How you speak, how you act, how you relate, how you pay attention. These are no longer small things. They are the way reality becomes real. And when you begin to see that clearly, the question is no longer about what is true in some abstract sense. It becomes much more immediate. Given that this is real in the only way it can be, how are you going to live inside it? So what remains is not an escape and not a final answer. It's a different way of standing inside your own life. You're no longer just reacting to what appears, and you're not trying to disappear from it either. You see more, you feel more, and at the same time you hold it more lightly. The illusion didn't end. You just learned how to see through it and still be here. Right now, look at your hands for a moment, not as something ordinary, but as part of this entire experience becoming real. Let that land, even if just for a second. If you made it this far, write this in the comments. I'm here and I see differently now. And if this connected with you, watch one of the videos on your screen. There's more waiting for you there.